brought you my top 15 running backs this past week. Now this week I'm bringing you my top 24 wide receivers going into the 2023 fantasy football season. Comment down below somebody you believe could easily finish in the top 24 that isn't ranked in the top 24 according to the ADP right now in the community. And as always, go to vlogfantasy.com/land, the best place to support everything that Zach and I are doing here at FantasyLand. Not only do you get our rankings, our articles, our bonus content, and so much more, you get it from all the other content creators. And hey, if you want to join a redraft league, all you have to do is sign up with vlogfantasy.com/land. Select the Mother Flocker tier and we can get you in a redraft league today, right now, or whenever you are watching this video. And then you can compete between myself and Zach and win a prize money pool in that league. So once again, vlogfantasy.com/land, the best way to support what Zach and I are doing here. And let's get straight into the rankings. All right, guys, you can see I have 7 tiers here for you, and I'm going to be breaking it down and having some conversation. So comment down below, let me know what you agree or disagree with here, and let's have a conversation in the chat or in the comments down below in the chat, as if I'm a live stream right now. All right, my wide receiver 1, I think no doubt about it, I think everyone's wide receiver 1 consensus wide receiver 1, that is Justin Jefferson. This past year finished as a wide receiver 1, over 21 fantasy points per game this past year, over 184 targets this past year as well. And I think that can easily continue, especially with a younger, more vibrant wide receiver coming in like Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson being on the team for a whole season instead of half of the season. And I think they're going to be passing the ball a little bit more than we expect than running the ball. Now that Dalvin's no longer on this team, and we kind of saw the regression, in the running back room this past year for the Vikings. And then I think that's just going to get pushed into the wide receiver room coming into the 2023 season. Okay, my tier 2. Before I get into my 3 players in this tier, I truly believe each and every one of these guys can easily finish as the wide receiver 1. Now, it's all up to you on who you believe that could be and who you believe should be in this tier, obviously. But my 3 guys, it's really hard to put them up against each other or one above the other. I think this is my wide receiver 2A, 2B, 2C, right? So my wide receiver 2A, that is Tyreek Hill. It's so difficult not to put him to put any other person above him because of the explosive plays that he can make and the boom games that he can have week in and week out. He can have a 40+ game, I feel like, 4 or 5 times out of the year. And this past year finished as a wide receiver 2. He did miss time. Well, no, he didn't miss time, but Tua missed time, which was a big reason why we see him finish as the wide receiver 2 this past year, averaging 20.1 fantasy points per game, over 1,700 yards, over 170 targets. I'm a massive advocate for Tua tags, and maybe some of you guys say, well, I'd rather have somebody else over. I understand. I think it all depends on your belief on this team, on the quarterback, and so on and so forth. But I think the targets, the opportunity, the explosive play, and how deadly this offense is, I think grants Tyreek Hill the wide receiver 2 coming into the 2023 season. My wide receiver 2 before I did this video and previous videos was Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp this past year, phenomenal year before he got injured. The first 7 weeks of the season, or first 10 weeks of the season, if I'm not mistaken, I think he played the first 10, and then he missed the second half of the season. He was a wide receiver 4, averaging 22.4 fantasy points per game. He was on pace for something incredible this past year, and I think that can easily continue with Matthew Stafford. Now, my biggest question mark here is Cooper Kupp going to be staying healthy, now pushing 30 years old, number 1? Number 2, what about Matthew Stafford? Can he stay healthy and play a full year? It's so difficult, but knowing the ceiling of Cooper Kupp and how no one else on this offense is truly a threat to take away targets from Cooper Kupp, right? You get rid of Allen Robinson. Van Jefferson is still kind of coming into his zone, right? They draft Puka Nacua, but Cooper Kupp is still the guy coming into this year. So I'm really confident with Cooper Kupp being my wide receiver 3. And I think a lot of people would disagree with where I have this wide receiver. Excuse me. But yeah, a lot of people would disagree where I have my wide receiver 4, and that is Jamar Chase. A lot of people have Jamar Chase as the 1A, 1B next to Justin Jefferson. But once again, the explosive plays, the pure target share of opportunity that I see Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp get over Jamar Chase, I believe is pretty significant. Not saying Jamar Chase doesn't get his target share. If I'm not mistaken, it was like over 33%. I think 1 out of 3 passes he was getting in every play, in every offensive drive, right? So that is pretty significant here. But Jamar Chase this past year, he did miss some time. He missed 4 games in the middle of the season. But when you really look at the first 7 weeks of the season, Jamar Chase, wide receiver 4, averaging over 20 points per game. I think that can easily continue, right? I can easily see any 3 of these wide receivers finishing as the wide receiver 1 or in this area. I think you had to really figure out which way you want to put him coming into this year. So my top 4 wide receivers, once again, easily, I can easily see them being the wide receiver 1 coming into the 2023 season. All right, going to my tier 3, going down to Stefon Diggs, another guy. I mean, look, another year, an opportunity with Josh Allen. Seems like hopefully they're on the same page now with all the rumors, all the accusations. I think it gets a little bit easier now coming into this year. You've always had Gabe Davis that you had to watch in the straight. You always are in the secondary. But now getting Dalton Kincaid, I think a lot of offenses are going to have to really game plan around him. Probably not in the first half of the season, but maybe the second half of the season. But Stefon Diggs, a year and a half or a year or 2 removed from finishing as the wide receiver 1 or leading the league in targets in a couple years ago. This past year finished as a wide receiver 4, 156 targets, averaging 18.9 fantasy points per game. That can easily continue with Josh Allen. And another guy I can easily see be a top 5 wide receiver coming into the 2023 season. My wide receiver 6, that is CeeDee Lamb, another guy. I mean, they bring in help in Brandon Cooks, Michael Gallup, another year removed from this injury. You get rid of Ezekiel Elliott, CeeDee Lamb this past year, finishing as the wide receiver 5. Over 156 targets, averaging 17.7 fantasy points per game. This offense, hopefully, we have to see what this looks like without Kellen Mond drawing up the plays here. I know Mike McCarthy is going to be the play caller, so let's see what's going to happen. But I still believe in CeeDee Lamb, his elite status, in my personal opinion, and he kind of proved himself to be a first-round draft pick in Dynasty and a redraft perspective coming into the 2023 season. And my last wide receiver going into my tier 3, that is A.J. Brown. Look, we all saw what he did with Jalen Hurts this past year. Jalen Hurts takes a massive step. He was a consistent wide receiver for you easily this past year. Wide receiver 6, averaging 17.6 fantasy points per game this past year. That can easily continue coming into the 2023 season. And once again, all these guys, my top here, what's this, 4, 5, 6, 7, my top 7 guys here, I can easily see them in a jumble way, however way you want to position them. They should easily be your top 7 wide receivers coming into this year. So I'm really excited about all my 7 guys. My next wide receiver, my wide receiver 8, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Hey, it's kind of crazy. 4th round draft pick, really coming to his own now. They're already talking about even bigger season with Jared Goff and Amon-Ra St. Brown. They are still seeing him as a true, we all are, and I think the Lions are as well. But J-Mo missing that 6 weeks, dealing with that leg injury, them really looking around the room saying, who the hell else are we going to target outside of our running backs and tight ends in the wide receiver room? That is Amon-Ra St. Brown, and that's going to continue. This past year, wide receiver 7, 16.7 fantasy points, 146 targets. But then remind you, he did miss a couple of games, really only 2 games this past year. 1 game this past year. Didn't really hinder him too much, but he, once again, didn't miss a game. So that kind of put him back this year. So that is my wide receiver. Keep losing count. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. My wide receiver 8. My wide receiver 9, hopefully I can keep track of this. My wide receiver 9, Garrett Wilson. A lot of people are easily believing, as myself, that Aaron Rodgers is going to come in and solidify him as a top 5, top 3 wide receiver, as we've seen with Devontae Adams in the past. We've seen the quotes of Aaron Rodgers says, he looks like another 17 I played with, and I completely agree. Garrett Wilson, my wide receiver 1, coming out of his class, and I think that can easily continue. We saw that with Mike White, Joe Flacco, and Zach Wilson, easily the 2-time MVP, NFL MVP, and Aaron Rodgers can easily surpass and put Garrett Wilson in the top 5, top 3 wide receiver contention, and maybe we will see Garrett Wilson next year as in a tier 2, tier 2, tier 3 type of conversation because of how we know now with the contract restructure with Aaron Rodgers, and this is fantastic in a dynasty perspective of another year with Garrett Wilson, another year with Aaron Rodgers, and next year, and maybe even talking about next year now, we can see him going into the top tier 2 here. My next wide receiver is Jalen Waddle coming in. A lot of people don't really love Jalen Waddle, and what's so interesting, I bought Jalen Waddle as one of my must draft wide receivers this past week, and a lot of people are saying I don't want to draft Jalen Waddle because Tua Tag is going to get injured. Tua Tags, without Tua, Jalen Waddle can't really perform. And if that is truly the case, I would initially say, well, Tyreek Hill should be the same. But a lot of people think Tyreek Hill is quarterback proof. Maybe that is the case. Maybe it's not the case. But I think where Tyreek Hill goes, Jalen Waddle is somewhere close to it. I would say a mid to early second round pick. I truly believe Jalen Waddle should be. We've seen him averaging 16.6 fantasy points when Tua is on the field, and then obviously you see a drop when he wasn't on the field. But once again, I'm a massive advocate of Tua coming in to this year. Jalen Waddle, the wide receiver 8 to this past year, 15.2 fantasy points, over 117 targets. This offense gets better. Another year under his belt with this offensive coordinator, Mike McDaniels, and so much more. I'm excited for Jalen Waddle coming in to this year. My next wide receiver, this is my largest tier so far on this list, and that is Chris Olave, my next wide receiver on this list, and he is going and stepping into a better situation. Derek Carr by far is, I would say, the best quarterback he is going to play with so far in his career. We've seen the success that Derek Carr has produced in a wide receiver standpoint, and Amari Cooper, even Hunter Renfrow. We can even throw in Darren Waller in there, and Devontae Adams this past year. Obviously, everyone is this extremely different talent. Chris Olave, a first-round draft pick, just a year removed now, coming into this offense. Is Michael Thomas going to stay healthy? I'm not necessarily sure. If Michael Thomas does stay healthy, maybe this opens up a little bit more opportunity for Chris Olave. Or maybe when Michael Thomas is injured again, Chris Olave, we all know, is going to be receiving the targets that we all expect him to receive coming into this year. So I'm really happy with Chris Olave. My next wide receiver on my list in tier 4, Devonta Smith. I kept bringing him up this last year. I wasn't too bold on him. I was saying he can finish easily as a top 22 wide receiver. I wish I was even bolder, saying he can finish as a top 10, because that's exactly what he did this past year. Finishes wide receiver 9, 136 targets, averaging 15 fantasy points per game. Jalen Hurts, I was a massive believer of Jalen Hurts coming in. I was a believer of Jalen Hurts, not a massive believer. I was a believer. Don't want to change the expectations here or kind of ruin it, because I was kind of skeptical. I would say I was more on the believer side than disbelief on Jalen Hurts, but wasn't a massive believer. Wasn't expecting him to finish as a QB3, QB5, right? Anyways, Devonta Smith, I think that can easily continue coming into this year. He's an elite wide receiver 1B, 1B, you kind of think of the Jordan Adams that we're talking about. We're thinking of the T. Higgins that we're talking about, 1B type of wide receiver coming into this to this year. And a wide receiver that a lot of people are probably saying, where the hell is this guy? Why isn't he in your top 10? Why is this happening? I don't understand. And I am not with consensus with the community. The community on Underdog right now, wide receiver 10 in the community on Underdog, but my wide receiver 13, that is Devontae Adams. Look, this past year finished as a wide receiver 3. Completely understand. Jimmy G, and I was really concerned if Jimmy G was going to play. Everything now is indicating that he is going to be okay coming into this season. He was clear for training camp. It looks like he's going to get the chemistry and get everything underway. And maybe I need to readjust my rankings. But as of right now, because my rankings are fluid as we get closer and closer to the season, and once the season gets closer, we'll put a final wide receiver list out for you. But for me, Devontae Adams is my wide receiver 13. That sounds crazy to say, but I think we're going to see a massive regression. I think we're going to see the thing is, I don't think Devontae Adams as a talent is going to regress. I don't think he's going to regress because of injury or because of his age. I think he's going to regress because of the quarterback play. And a lot of people think he is quarterback proof. In reality, we've only seen him play with 2 quarterbacks. right, in his career, essentially with Aaron Rodgers and Derek Carr, and Derek Carr had the history with him in college. I just don't see it with Jimmy G. I think there's going to be a lot of inconsistencies. Maybe we'll have boom games where Davante Adams finishes the top 5 wide receiver that week, and then we'll have the next week where Davante Adams is outside the top 20 or top 15. That's the boom bust type of weeks I see. I don't know if there's going to be a consistency where Davante Adams is a consistent wide receiver 6 or 7. I don't see that happening, and I could be wrong, and I'm not with consensus with the community. I just think a lot of his production was coming from the deep passes this past year with Derek Carr, and Jimmy G is known to throw in the middle of the field more short intermediate passes, especially with Josh Jacobs. If he does hold out coming into this year, that can really hurt Davante Adams in the 2023 season. So hey, once again, it's fluid. Let's have a conversation. I know I'm really against consensus here, so I think a lot of people would disagree, but that's okay. My next wide receiver and my first wide receiver in my tier 5, that is T. Higgins, another wide receiver 1A or wide receiver 1B, right? I mean, we saw what he did this past year. He did miss some time, finished wide receiver 18, averaging 14.9 fantasy points per game. Easily that can continue. Joe Burrow, probably the last quarterback, I would say. I can't think off the top of my head, the last quarterback to wait for his contract extension. So let's see how much money he's going to get paid, because you're going to have to pay Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Joe Burrow. Good luck to the Cincinnati Bengals on that one. T. Higgins easily a wide receiver 1 on any other team, but he is the wide receiver 1B in my wide receiver 14 coming into this season. Keenan Allen, my next wide receiver. Keenan Allen, we all know what he can do. We all seen that he can be a top wide receiver coming into the NFL. The question is, can he stay healthy? Missed 7 games this past year, but when we saw him come back into this season, we saw him really take off coming in to the 2023 season. I just want to bring up his stats because I didn't have him when he did come back. Here we go. Wide receiver 7 from weeks 11 to 17 when he came back from that injury, averaging 17.2 fantasy points per game, 72 targets, nearly over 570 yards on the ground, or in the air, excuse me. That's more than Tyreek Hill, more than Amari Cooper, more than T. Higgins, and so much more. I think Keenan Allen, if he does stay healthy, we can easily see him as a top 15 wide receiver coming into the 2023 season. So I feel really confident with Keenan Allen coming into this year. My next wide receiver is Amari Cooper. Hey, Amari had a good season this year. Wide receiver 10, over 132 targets in the air, 14.5 fantasy points. Surely that gets better, because that was with Jacoby Brissett. Now we have Deshaun Watson, arguably one of the best quarterbacks for this offense or for this organization, right? Hasn't finished always been a top 5 quarterback outside his rookie year and this past year. That can easily continue here for Amari Cooper. And once again, this offense just gets better with Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson has always produced a top 5, top 10 wide receiver in pass with Brandon Cooks, Will Fuller, and clearly DeAndre Hopkins. I'm really excited about Amari Cooper coming into this year. Now we have a tier break going into my tier 6, my second biggest tier coming into this year. Deebo Samuel. 13, 14, 15, 16, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. My wide receiver 17, guys, coming into this year. Deebo Samuel, look, something that I really wanted to bring up here. He did miss some time. He missed some time in the middle in week 8, and then he missed 3 games from weeks 15 to 17. So I really wanted to focus on the first half of the season with Deebo Samuel, with weeks 1 to 8. We saw what he kind of did in weeks 1 to 8, where he was the wide receiver. He kind of was in the mid here. He was the wide receiver 23, averaging 14.4 fantasy points per game. I think a lot of people are saying, well, maybe, hey, Deebo Samuel is a little bit too low for my liking. This offense is going to change. Now, the reason why Deebo Samuel has fallen significantly because of the addition of CMC. Remember that one year Deebo was a top 3, top 5 wide receiver? That was because he rushed for over 500 yards on the ground, nearly 500. I think, if I'm not mistaken, over 500 yards on the ground. that's taken away with Christian McCaffrey here. Deebo Samuel is really kind of limited to the passing game now. And maybe they'll get Mixie if CMC misses some time, whatever the case may be. But another big factor here is who is the quarterback. Trey Lance. If it's Trey Lance, even when Trey Lance was the starter, we were saying Deebo Samuel was going to take a massive hit because of the rushing upside of Trey Lance. Brock Purdy, a little bit different conversation, more of a pocket passer. We'll see what happens there. But Deebo Samuel is my wide receiver here at my tier 6. Christian Watson, my next wide receiver. Aaron Rodgers is gone. Jordan Love is here. Insert Jordan Love, but really the wide receiver one on this team. There's no one else here. I am a massive believer of Jordan Love and what he can do coming into this season. Christian Watson really came onto his own the second half of the season, became a league winner for the majority of the people, and one of the most disrespected wide receivers, I would say, in the community. And a lot of people were giving him disrespect, even with Aaron Rodgers, more disrespect here with Jordan Love. But I like Christian Watson right here in my tier 6. Now we have DeAndre Hopkins with the Tennessee Titans. We all know what DeAndre Hopkins can do. We all know how Ryan Tannehill can produce a top wide receiver, as we've seen in the past with A.J. Brown. DeAndre Hopkins, clearly an older wide receiver, but I would say he is the most quarterback-proof wide receiver we've seen in a long time, who has played, if I'm not mistaken, over 10 to 12 different quarterbacks, and this is just another quarterback he's adding onto his list that he is going to get a bunch of targets, a bunch of opportunity coming here with the Tennessee Titans. A little bit less of a passing offense, but hey, maybe we can see a little bit more consistency somehow, some way with DeAndre Hopkins coming into this year. I always say this, and I agree with Zach. I don't say this. Zach always says this, and I agree with Zach. Wherever Deebo Samuel goes, Brandon Ayuk is really, really near. And a lot of people have Brandon Ayuk higher than Deebo Samuel. And I think Brandon Ayuk should be considered here in tier 6 coming into this year. Clearly, Deebo Samuel missed some time this past year, right? But Brandon Ayuk, when finished this year, wide receiver 15, averaging 13.4 fantasy points per game. But when you really break down the time that Deebo Samuel did miss from weeks 1 to 14, if I'm not mistaken, Deebo Samuel, wide receiver 21. Brandon Ayuk, wide receiver 18. Deebo Samuel technically was averaging more fantasy points per game, right? Deebo averaging 13.7 fantasy points per game, but Brandon Ayuk averaging 13.4 fantasy points per game, still having a higher wide receiver finish. Obviously, probably because of the games that were missed, but I think I can even see myself maybe even swapping that around or bringing Deebo lower and having them back to back in my rankings as we get closer. Once again, I'm going to be having a final wide receiver list as we get closer into the season. My next wide receiver, DK Metcalf, and my last wide receiver on this list, finishes wide receiver 16 this past year, 13.3 fantasy points per game. Does that change now with Jackson Smith and Jigba coming into this year? Absolutely. I think a lot of people are saying, well, this offense really has to take account for Jackson Smith and Jigba in the slot. Maybe DK Metcalf is not going to be seeing, double teams too much with another extra safety going down the field. Maybe he's going to be the field stretcher where he can go up and can contest the catch on the sideline, and that's exactly what I see DK Metcalf, doing coming into the 2023 season. So that's kind of where I like DK right now. Going to my tier 7. Have 4 more wide receivers here, a couple honorable mentions, a little bit more difficult. I only have 6 minutes here, so plenty of time. Calvin Ridley is my next wide receiver, and the community has him a crazy value here. I think he's a wide receiver 16 or 15 in the community on Underdog. He's a little bit different: 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. My wide receiver 22. Now the question with Calvin Ridley, it's not even a question for me. My thought process coming into this year with Calvin Ridley, yes, Calvin Ridley, with the history, he has an upside as a wide receiver, top 10 wide receiver, no doubt about it. But nearly hasn't played for almost 2 years, a year and a half-ish, playing with a whole new quarterback. And I think it's going to take a little bit more time for him to really get his feet underneath him and really get that chemistry with Trevor Lawrence that we expect in a real game time situation. So I love Calvin Ridley, and I'm okay to be wrong here, but I don't know if I can take him, over T. Higgins, over Keenan Allen, over Amari Cooper. If Keenan Allen stays healthy, I'm taking Calvin Ridley over him. I think that's where the community has him right now. So Calvin Ridley here feels really great. My next wide receiver is Jerry Jeudy, baby. I believe in Jerry Jeudy. He was my guy last year. Clearly didn't pan out with Nathaniel Hackett and Russell Wilson. Now insert Sean Payton. And I think this wide receiver room and this offense is going to take a next level coming into the 2023 season. Sean Payton has a history of success and, points per game in the NFL per, in his stint with the New Orleans Saints. Russell Wilson has always produced a top 15 at least wide receiver coming into the season outside of genuinely these past 2 years, the last year with the Seahawks and this past year with the Denver Broncos. So I'm really believing in Jerry Jeudy step up coming into this season. So that is my next wide receiver. My next wide receiver after Jerry Jeudy is Drizzy Drake London here. Sorry, I keep forgetting the numbers. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. Yeah, my wide receiver 24. So my wide receiver 24 is Drake London coming into this year. I'm a massive believer. We saw all the perceptions. We saw all the uptick and kind of this offense take off here, especially when we saw Kyle Pitts missing some time coming into this year. I think that's going to take the next step here. Marcus Mariota did struggle at times, but hey, Desmond Ridder here is going to open up the playbook just a little bit more coming into this year. We saw how successful he was in college. I mean, he was playing with Michael Pittman, or around with Michael Pittman and Amon-Ra St. Brown. He was coming from a phenomenal school at the USC, and I think that can easily translate here coming into his second year as a wide receiver. Some honorable mentions here as my next wide receivers in no particular order, right? Because I always say this when we do mock drafts, wherever Calvin Ridley goes, I always like to see where Christian Kirk goes. He normally goes nearly 2 rounds later in our mock drafts. Christian Kirk, I think, is a good value. I see him having the ability to finish as a wide receiver, top 15 wide receiver, but you can get him 2 rounds later and still have that upside, in my opinion. He would finish as a wide receiver 12 this past year. Maybe he falls outside of the top. Maybe he's a top 15 wide receiver, right? Maybe he's a top 17 wide receiver, where Calvin Ridley, has the upside as a top 5, but for that price, I'm not necessarily sure I love it. Next wide receiver here for honorable mentions, DJ Moore. I kind of expect Justin Fields to take a next big step here. Better offensive line, more opportunity for DJ Moore coming into this year. And my last guy here that I really love, that's still a little bit further down in my rank, is Deontay Johnson. Another guy I really like coming into the 2023 season, but I think his value is starting to rise, and I think a lot of people are starting to see that. My top 24 wide receivers, let me know what you guys think. What do you agree? What you disagree with? Comment down below and let's have a conversation. And as always, guys, it's all love.
Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy, even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.